a small cemetery. Gray skies loom overhead as light rain drizzles, setting a somber mood. The world feels heavy today, a cloud hanging over the crowd that's gathered to say goodbye. At the center of it all, a young black boy, Malik, just 5 years old. His black jacket is too big for his small frame. His hands tremble, and his eyes are wide with a mix of confusion and curiosity. The world around him is foreign, filled with adults dressed in dark suits and mourning the loss of someone he doesn't know. He wasn't invited here, but he had to come. He had to see for himself. His tiny feet shuffle along the damp grass, avoiding the puddles as best as he can. The soft patter of raindrops is the only sound aside from the priest's steady voice. In front of him, a grand wooden coffin. It's polished, gleaming with the care of 1,000 hands that have prepared it for this moment. The white lilies resting on top are vibrant against the dark wood. But the coffin is just the beginning. The man inside? Robert Calloway, a wealthy businessman known in the city as a titan of industry, beloved by many, a pillar of success. To everyone here, Robert Calloway was a giant, a man who had built his empire, one who had the money, the connections, the respect, a man who would be remembered as someone who had it all. Yet, for all of his wealth and stature, he left this world alone. No family, no one to carry on his legacy. And that's when Malik, standing at the edge of the crowd, clenches something in his tiny hand. His fingers are cold from the rain, but the object he holds is even colder. A necklace, old and rusted, with an engraving on the back. The chain has clearly seen better days, but it's precious to him, as if it has been handed down for generations. A secret, forgotten by the world, that only Malik understands. His breath catches as the priest finishes his words, the final prayer for a man he never knew, but whose name has haunted Malik's dreams for as long as he could remember. And that's when Malik whispers, in a shaky voice that quivers with uncertainty, but carries an undeniable weight, "That's my father." The words hang in the air. The crowd's chatter silences for a moment. Gasps ripple through the mourners. Heads turn. Eyes shift nervously. The whispers spread like wildfire, carried on the wind, and suddenly, the young boy is the center of attention. The faces around him are a mix of disbelief and suspicion. Who is this boy? And why would he say such a thing? The priest pauses, his gaze flicking down at Malik, and then back at the coffin. A moment of uncomfortable silence fills the space between them. The air is thick with questions that have no answers, and the whole scene begins to feel like a dream, a surreal blur of faces, whispers, and rain. The crowd, once composed of respectful mourners, now seems more like spectators at a scene they don't fully understand. Every gaze is now on Malik, this small boy who has suddenly placed himself at the heart of a mystery. As Malik stands there, barely able to process the weight of his own words, his eyes lock on the coffin once more. In that moment, he isn't just a forgotten child. He's something more, something unknown. But what if he's right? What if Robert Calloway was his father? And if so, why did no one know about him? Why had this secret been buried so deeply? The rain continues to fall, unnoticed by the crowd now staring at Malik, waiting for him to explain. But he can't, not yet. Where are you watching from? What time is it? Drop a comment below. The cemetery was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft murmur of the gathering crowd. The air was thick with tension as Malik stood there, holding the necklace that had once belonged to his father. Eleanor Calloway, standing at the front of the crowd, turned sharply as the words, "I know it," echoed in the air. Her posture stiffened, eyes narrowing in disbelief and anger. "What did you just say?" she spat, her voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. Malik didn't flinch. His heart was pounding, but his resolve remained unshaken. He gripped the necklace tighter in his small hands. He was my dad. I know it. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would happen next. Malik's words hung in the air, and for a moment the world felt frozen in time. At that moment, a lawyer stepped forward, his voice awkward but firm as he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Calloway, perhaps we should handle this privately." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was already moving toward Malik, her steps quick and determined, her face contorted in fury. Her hands shook as she approached, her voice now low but seething. "This is ridiculous. My husband would never—" She stopped in front of Malik, glaring down at him with contempt. "Someone get this child out of here!" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of the situation. The weight of Eleanor's words and the way she directed her anger at a child, Malik, was palpable. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, a soft voice broke through the storm of emotions. "Wait!" Everyone turned to look at the source of the voice. It was an elderly woman who had been standing quietly in the back, observing the scene. She had a calm demeanor about her, and the way she spoke held the kind of authority that made even the most obstinate pause. Eleanor, still seething, turned sharply toward the woman, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "What is it now?" she demanded, her patience worn thin. The elderly woman slowly stepped forward, her gaze moving between Malik and Eleanor. There was a pause as she looked at the young boy, then back at Eleanor, before speaking in a tone that was both gentle and firm. "The boy is telling the truth." The words landed like a thunderclap. The crowd fell silent once again, the murmurs dying down as all eyes turned to the woman. Eleanor's expression faltered for just a moment. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. Her eyes searched the woman's face, then shifted to the necklace still held tightly in Malik's hand. I'm his father's sister," the elderly woman said, looking directly at Eleanor. "I've been watching him, waiting for the right moment. Your husband was his uncle." Malik's eyes widened in disbelief, his breath caught in his throat. His whole life had felt like a question mark, but now the truth was starting to take shape. Eleanor stared at the elderly woman for a long moment. The fury in her eyes softened, replaced with confusion and, just perhaps, a hint of guilt. Eleanor's fists clenched at her sides. She opened her mouth to argue again, but this time the words caught in her throat. There was nothing more she could say. I don't believe this," Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking. The elderly woman continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "Your husband never told you, did he? He kept it a secret, hoping to protect the boy." The crowd remained silent, their collective breath held as the weight of the truth settled in the air. Eleanor's gaze slowly drifted down to the necklace once more. Her eyes softened, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. She seemed to wrestle with the truth, her mind racing. Malik, still holding the necklace, felt a strange sense of vindication mixed with sadness. His whole life had been built on unanswered questions and hidden truths. But now, finally, the pieces were falling into place. The elderly woman stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You've waited long enough, my dear. Your father loved you. He always did." The crowd, still processing the weight of the situation, began to whisper among themselves again. This time, however, the whispers held a different tone, one of sympathy and perhaps understanding. Eleanor, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, took a deep breath. Her face still held a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something darker. But beneath it, there was something else, an acknowledgement that the truth had found its way into the open. Malik stood his ground, his small face set with determination. He had waited for this moment his whole life, and now no one could take it away from him. The past was behind him, and the future? That was his to claim. The room was thick with tension. Ruth's eyes widened as she processed the name, and her gaze shifted to Eleanor, who was now silent, her lips pressed tight. "You're saying this child, this boy, is your son?" Ruth's voice trembled. Her question hung in the air, and the answer seemed to loom in the silence. Malik, standing there with a sense of unease swirling in his stomach, nodded slowly. His heart raced, the truth threatening to come crashing down on him all at once. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he hadn't thought the revelation would hit this hard. Eleanor stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "That's impossible," she muttered, but the way her eyes flickered gave her away. Deep down, she knew it wasn't. She had long suspected something. Malik's hands tightened into fists. His mother, Jasmine, had told him stories of Robert, but those stories had always been about a man who had abandoned her. He never imagined that Robert could have been his father, too, living a different life, one that had no room for him or his mother. The idea of a secret family felt like a punch to the gut. "You know this boy," Ruth said, her voice quiet but firm, addressing Eleanor, "don't you? You know he's Robert's son." The accusation hung heavily between them, and Eleanor visibly flinched, her face betraying her. Ruth's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You've known about this all along, haven't you? Robert had a child with her, and you didn't tell him. You didn't let him know his own flesh and blood." Eleanor opened her mouth to say something, but her words faltered. She looked between Ruth and Malik, unsure of how to respond. She shifted uncomfortably, the guilt written all over her face. Malik stood in front of them, confused and hurt. He hadn't known what to expect, but this wasn't it. He had no idea how deeply entwined his mother's past was with Robert's. He had been left to piece together a life with only fragments of stories from the woman who raised him. The life his mother had lived before him was a mystery, one that he was now thrust into, whether he liked it or not. "I never wanted this for you, Malik," Eleanor finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "I never wanted you to know the truth. I thought it would be easier to keep things hidden. But this is too much." Malik looked her in the eye, his voice barely above a whisper. "So you were just going to let me live a lie? Let me believe I had no one?" The hurt in his words pierced the air, and for the first time, Eleanor seemed to truly see him, not just as a complication, but as the son of the man who had once meant something to her. Ruth, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke again. "I know Robert. He might have been a fool, but he wasn't heartless. He would have wanted to know. He would have wanted to be here, to meet his son." Tension swirled around the room as the realization of what was being unveiled began to settle in. There was so much left unsaid, so many lies that had been built over the years. This wasn't just about Robert anymore. This was about Malik, his future, and the truth that had been hidden for far too long. As the silence stretched on, Malik's heart beat erratically. He didn't know what to think anymore. He wasn't sure if the answers he had been looking for would bring him peace or more questions. But one thing was for sure. He wasn't going to let this family's secrets define him any longer. "Do you really think I'm Robert's son?" Malik's voice was steady now, his gaze unwavering. Or are you just hoping I'll disappear like you've made everyone else disappear? Ruth and Eleanor exchanged another look, but this time there was no denying the truth that was slowly coming to the surface. What had Robert hidden from them all these years? What else was there to learn? And most importantly, what did it all mean for Malik? Would he now be part of something bigger than himself? Would he find the answers he had been searching for? The questions seemed endless, and the weight of them bore down on him like never before. What do you think is next for Malik? Do you think he should trust what he's learned or keep searching for more answers? Share your thoughts below. Malik takes a deep breath and holds up the rusted necklace. My mom gave me this before she passed. She said it belonged to my father. Eleanor snatches it from his hands, inspecting the back, and suddenly her face drains of color. If you are reading this, I am gone. And if my son has found his way here, then fate has finally corrected my mistake. The judge paused, his voice thick with emotion, before continuing. Jasmine, if you are no longer with us, please tell our boy that I never stopped thinking about him. I never had the courage to come back, but I always hoped he would one day find me. The words felt heavy, like a weight pushing down on everyone in the room. The judge's voice wavered slightly as he went on. To my family, I know this is a shock, but Malik is my son, and I want him to have what I never gave him in life. A home, a name, and a place where he belongs. A stunned silence washed over the courtroom. Eleanor Calloway, who had been sitting with her head high just moments before, now looked as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She stumbled back slightly, eyes wide, mouth agape. Malik stood frozen in place. His mind raced as the words sunk in, the enormity of it all crashing over him. A man he had never known, someone who had been absent from his life, was now leaving him his fortune. The very fortune that had always seemed so out of reach, like a distant dream. The Calloway family, who had sat so smugly through the whole proceeding, their expressions dripping with entitlement, were now quiet, their faces draining of color as they absorbed the reality that this child, this boy they had always treated as invisible, was now part of the family legacy. And then the final bombshell hit. The judge cleared his throat and without any more delay read the last line from the letter. I leave half of my estate to my son, Malik. Gasps filled the room. The sound of shocked breaths escaping from every corner was deafening. Some looked at each other in disbelief, while others looked back at Malik, now standing at the center of it all. His life, which had once been filled with hardship and uncertainty, was now about to change forever. He was no longer just a forgotten child of the streets. Malik was one of the richest kids in the city. His eyes were still wide with disbelief. His heart raced in his chest as the weight of the words settled into his bones. He had come here today to learn the truth about his parentage, but he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to hear that he was the heir to a vast fortune, a fortune that could give him everything he'd ever dreamed of. Eleanor Calloway's expression twisted in disbelief. She couldn't hide the shock, and for the first time, Malik saw her facade crack. She had assumed the inheritance would stay in the family, that her place as the sole beneficiary was untouchable. But Malik, someone she had never once considered as part of her family, was now standing at the center of the storm. Her voice, which had always commanded attention, faltered. This isn't right. He's just a child. But the judge's gaze was unwavering. He had heard enough. He nodded slowly and set the letter down. This is the decision of the court. Malik is to inherit half of his father's estate as his rightful son. The rest of the will stands. Now, he had a chance, a real chance, to build a future. Do you think Malik deserves the inheritance? One of the reporters in the back whispered, catching the moment on camera. The words hit the room like a wave. There were gasps, whispers, and a few stunned faces as the decision was made official. Malik had heard it all before, the doubts, the disbelief, the accusations of fraud. But now, in this moment, there was no more denying it. His blood, his history, was tied irrevocably to Robert Calloway, a man who had been taken from him too soon. It was a hard truth to swallow, but one that would now shape his life forever. Eleanor's lawyer tried one final argument. Your Honor, we request that this decision be reevaluated. There is still much we don't know about this boy's true parentage. The judge, a stern woman who had witnessed her fair share of family battles, shook her head. The necklace, the letter, the undeniable resemblance between you, Mrs. Calloway, and this boy, there is nothing left to dispute. The law has spoken. Eleanor's face turned pale. She hadn't expected it to end like this. For all her schemes, all her manipulations, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. As the courtroom session ended, the family filed out, and Malik was left standing there, feeling the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. No one had ever told him he mattered. He had spent his life trying to prove that he was worthy of love, worthy of respect. But now, as he walked out of the courtroom, the truth was clear. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of something, part of a family, the family he had never known. His grandmother, Ruth, stood waiting by the door, her hands trembling. When she saw Malik approach, a smile broke out across her face, a smile full of pride and love. "You did it," she whispered as she reached for him. "You're part of the family now." Malik looked into her eyes, his heart swelling. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to belong. Ruth took his hand and led him out of the courthouse. The bright afternoon sun poured down on them as they walked together, leaving behind the remnants of the life Malik had lived, a life of struggle, uncertainty, and isolation. Now, he was walking into a new future. And it wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. The money didn't matter. What mattered was that Malik had found his place in the world, and he knew he was worthy of it. The only thing that mattered now was family. Malik had fought for this moment. He had stood up for himself when no one else would. And as he held Ruth's hand, he knew there was no turning back. He was finally free from the shadows of his past, walking forward into a life filled with love, acceptance, and the knowledge that he would never again have to prove that he mattered. He wasn't just Robert Calloway's son in name. He was his son, and he belonged. The legacy that once seemed out of reach now lay before him, an opportunity to build the life he had always dreamed of, not on his own, but with the family he had found. Do you believe fate always finds a way? Ruth's voice broke through his thoughts as they walked side by side. Malik nodded, his eyes bright with promise. I think it always does. And with that, they disappeared into the sunshine, ready to embrace a new chapter in their lives. Do you believe fate always finds a way? Let us know.